The Ice in the Reflection by Michael A. Bonus. Was it worth it? Snow-filled wind roared through the air as a seasonal snowstorm raged within the equestrian Badlands. Large banks of snow lay scattered throughout the large plain, and each one seemed to alternate between shrinking and growing. From a distance, the scene would seem calm and peaceful, but from within the storm, the scene was much different. From within the whirling winds and falling snow, a lone, pony-like creature trudged through the thick snow. She battled the storm for each step, and the storm fought back with each frozen gust that blew at her muzzle. The figure wore a dark cloak that covered her body and was the only thing providing her with any warmth or protection from the elements. The fabric flailed with the wind, and the figure struggled to even keep the cloak on her. The figure took a few more steps before the cloak caught on one of her hooves, causing her to fall face first into the snow. The figure picked up her hat and shook off the snow that clung to her face. She pulled down the cloak's hood and revealed her jagged horn and wispy, cyan mane. She was once Grand Queen of the Changelings, but had fallen from her once grand position. The former queen glanced up at the sky, her face almost emotionless. As the storm continued to rage around her, Chrysalis fell back onto her flank, only to continue to stare up at the stars, which barely breached their light through the storm.
How could this have happened?
Chrysalis thought to herself, eyes still glued to the sky.
How have I fallen so far?
A particularly strong gust blew into Chrysalis's face, catching her hood and causing it to blow away. She tried desperately to run after it, but the wind was too strong and she was too weak. With her only form of protection gone, the former queen began to shiver. Fearing that she would perish if left in the elements, Chrysalis continued her journey forwards, her only goal to find shelter. The land in front of her was vast, and seemed to constantly shift as the storm continued to rage. Nothing lived in this part of Equestria, and there was a reason for that. Finding shelter seemed impossible, but the former queen couldn't give up. She had to keep going. Her eyes stung from the cold, and her muscles burned with each step, threatening to give out. The first stages of hypothermia had begun to kick in, giving Chrysalis a jolt of false heat. She knew it was only a sign that her body couldn't endure much more, but that didn't stop her. Opening her eyes to the elements, the queen suddenly felt a burst of hope fill her core. About 100 yards or so in front of her was what seemed like the entrance to a cave. With a renewed sense of purpose, Chrysalis began her trot towards the entrance as fast as her weakened legs could take her. Each step felt like a marathon. The 100-yard trek felt like a mile. When she finally made it to the entrance to the cave, Chrysalis's chapped lips curled into a light smile. The cave wasn't that large, maybe being about half the size of her old bedroom. But even though it was small, the inside was still shielded from the wind and snow. Chrysalis shuffled into the cave, collapsing as soon as she couldn't feel the icy wind on her back anymore. She smiled, finally being able to relax. Her body was still weak, the threat of death only being postponed for the time being. Chrysalis knew this, but decided not to dwell on her impending death, knowing how it would only bring her more pain than she was already in. She lay there in silence, the only noise coming from the storm that continued to rage outside. But the silence didn't last. A voice, barely a whisper, suddenly spoke above the storm.
Ironic, isn't it?
Chrysalis's eyes shot open and she immediately tried to get up. Her attempt ended in a scream of pain as her sore and weak limbs quit on her, making her fall back onto the cold cave floor.
After all that talk of me being weak, it is you who has collapsed onto the floor.
The voice began again. Chrysalis grunted, curling her lips into a scowl.
I thought I got rid of you.
She hissed as she managed to rise to a seated position. The voice lightly chuckled.
I thought so too, but apparently not.
The former queen's eyes darted around the cave until finally resting on a puddle of ice not far in front of her. The puddle held the image of Chrysalis, but in much better condition. The image smiled at the real Chrysalis, who let out a loud growl in response.
Why have you returned?
She asked, holding back another wave of pain.
Is it to mock me, or is it some form of satisfaction of seeing me fail?
The image shook her head sadly.
I have not returned for you, but for me.
The image began, lowering her gaze.
I came to see how foolish I was for letting you take over.
Chrysalis, the real one, shook her head, looking dejected.
Well, I guess it was both of us who were fools then.
There was a pause.
Is it all over?
The reflection spoke up.
Is this the end of me?
She paused.
Is this the end of us?
Chrysalis chuckled.
It appears to be that way.
Another pause.
Was it worth it?
Chrysalis didn't answer at first, instead staring emotionless at the storm that continued to rage outside of the cave, seeming deep in contemplation. After a few more minutes of silence, the former queen replied,
No.
Before continuing in a much quieter voice,
Not at all.
The image nodded sadly, seeming to both understand and feel the other's pain. After another minute or two, the image began to slowly fade back into Chrysalis's true reflection. Chrysalis, in turn, laid back down and closed her eyes, a single tear running down her cheek. Author's note. What is this, you may ask yourself? I thought the story was done. Well, my friend, I have news for you. It is, but I got bored and wrote more, so yeah. Hope you enjoy. Michael A. Comment time. Okay, every pony, this was the bonus chapter of Ice in the Reflection. Hope you liked it. As always, I have a Patreon through which you can support me, and this was actually a commission work for the author Michael A. Hope you enjoyed it. Sincerely yours, Visual Pony.